shadow dances, I am still. Peace is my companion. Joy is my friend. The campfire, the stars, the slight breeze, the taste of the hot chocolate, and the dancing shadows are, in themselves, enough. Here I am. Why waste time wanting to be somewhere else? Join me by the campfire.
Hello, everybody. I am Aaron Simmons, and I am so excited about this episode of Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons. And I want to make clear, the with J. Aaron Simmons is not some weird third personal ego thing. It's because I have some philosopher friends in New Zealand who reached out to me and notified me that they had a Campfire Philosophy podcast about a year ago. And so I am working with them actually to do some collaborative episodes. So hello to Nathan and Hamish over in New Zealand. And thanks so much to them for being charitable and us working together to make this work out for everybody. So I am so excited tonight. We are going to be talking about the question, does democracy need disagreement? And what's the difference between disagreement and division? And how does this stuff function in liberal societies like our own? And I am joined tonight by two guests who also happen to be good friends of mine. Kimberly Maslin, who is a professor and department chair of politics at Hendrix College, one of the universities I used to teach at. And so she and I had a great time as colleagues there, co-taught a class on Martin Heidegger and Hannah Arendt. And her work is absolutely fantastic. I want to recommend it to you. And in fact, you can learn more about her. I'll click the link up here. You can go to her website where you can also find links to some of her articles that are available. And then also I'll put a link up in a little while to her book on Hannah Arendt, which is absolutely fantastic, except for a blurb on the back, if I recall, maybe written by me. But yeah, other than that, the book is great. So thank you, Kim, so much for being with us. And my other guest is Scott Aikin, who is a professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University, who has written more than I can possibly describe. And in fact, Scott and I go way back. We were grad students together at Vanderbilt. And then after we both got our PhDs, we spent a year on the faculty together and shared an office, which goes down in my memory as hands down my favorite on-campus office experience of my career. Lots of heavy metal discussions and also some collaborative work. We co-authored some articles together that year, and it was great. I have a link here to his website. You can see his numerous books. He's done amazing work on everything from pragmatism to logic to stoicism, all the way, and skepticism, all the way up. And why he's invited tonight is because he's done amazing work on political agreement and disagreement. And in particular, make sure to check out his book that he co-authored with our mutual friend, Robert Talese, on political argument in a polarized age. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining me at the campfire.
It's great to be here.
Super to be here, Aaron. And I see that you're wearing the Gojira T-shirt. That is timely, good sir.
Right.
In light of the French opening ceremonies at the Olympics. Gojira rocking the house, representing the whole heavy metal movement. Every metalhead all over the world was grinning ear to ear after that. So
I got
on, friend.
My texts just blew up with, are you watching this? Did you just see this? Right. and yeah, it was amazing. And in fact, a statement of a kind of political critique in many ways, having Marie Antoinette, holding a head and all of their presentation. Yeah. So I thought talking about political philosophy on the sort of like, what they just did this a day ago, 2 days ago. And so, yeah, I had to represent Gojira. They were the last concert I saw before COVID. And so, yeah, they also hold a special place. They reminded me why I needed to get out of COVID. And then recently went to my first concert post-COVID, which was Norma Jean. And so that was also a heck of a show. So, yeah. Well, thank you both for being here. To everybody watching, let me remind you, you can join the conversation. All you've got to do is drop comments on whatever platform you are watching it. When it live streams, the conversation is in real time on our end. And so that way we can rope you into the conversation, spotlight some of your questions and respond to the concerns or issues or objections that you might have to what we're talking about. So here's my thought for why I wanted to do this episode. And maybe this will lead us into getting some initial thoughts from both of you. Last week, I did a episode on why we need public intellectuals today. And I was joined by two amazing scholars, had a wonderful time. But what kept showing up from all of us was this commitment that public intellectuals are required because we, social beings, especially in contemporary America, tend to be very, very bad at deliberative engagement. We are not good at argument. And given that we're not good at argument, this then leads to all kinds of social consequences, right? It creates a ease toward conspiracy theories. It leads to a slippage relative to concerns for evidence. And it also then fosters this group polarization and echo chamber phenomenon that actually just deepens from disagreement to radical division, where we now don't see people as those reasonable people with whom we disagree, but we now see them as an enemy, oppositional, a problem to the very social fabric in which we find ourselves, right? And so we were talking a lot about how public intellectuals have a responsibility to model doing that stuff more effectively. And so during that conversation, I was like, oh my God, we've got to go from just public intellectual work to the actual political theory that underwrites that kind of commitment. And this is where both of your work immediately jumped out. Hannah Arendt's work, of course, on social ontologies, on the very idea of the public, on what social spaces look like and how they function. And then Scott, obviously, I think your work is some of the best in the game, you and Rob, on why we need argument and then how we should conduct it, right? Like what that looks like. So maybe we can just start off tonight. Scott, we'll start with you since, again, you've kind of given us a lot of the categories that I and many others use for thinking about these things. What is it that you see disagreement to be as a kind of epistemically virtuous thing? Like, why is that something that is actually good for finding ourselves as responsible, as you put it, you know, people with good cognitive hygiene? Why is disagreement helpful in that task?
Well, maybe we'll start with just the simple fact that it's hard to catch your own errors whenever you're making them. And so I teach a regular logic class. I regularly teach these logic classes. And one of the things that regularly emerges whenever I teach this, and I mean, look, I teach at Vanderbilt University. These students are all really college ready. They're all highly motivated to do well. They're all primed to want to do well in a logic class. They're taking the logic class, for Christ's sakes. So they're there wanting to do well, but they make errors and they're highly motivated to not, and it's still hard to not. And it's in some ways because of the nature of what it is to have beliefs and to make inferences. For you to have a belief, you got to think that something's true. You got to think that you're getting something right if you believe it. And if you think that something's right, then it looks like it goes the other way. It goes back over to a belief. And the same thing works with reasoning. And it's, as it turns out, that if you think that the premises or the inputs of some reasoning are correct, and you're inclined to think that the output looks good, you're inclined, just again, this is just a psychological phenomenon called the belief bias, that you're inclined to think that the reasoning's good, even if the reasoning itself is actually quite bad, formally bad. And the result then is that we have to have people with whom we disagree, who in some ways haven't pulled the wool over their own eyes, to make us slow down and explain how we got there. So here, a very simple example is a simple syllogism. All dogs are mammals, premise one. Premise two is some mammals are pets. Fine. Right. The conclusion is some dogs are pets. Now that feels like, I'm sure to you and to our readers and even to our listeners and even to me as I'm doing it, it's like, that feels good. Yeah. But the problem is that the form of that reasoning is actually very bad. I can just reproduce that form and produce a counterexample. All squares are polygons. Some polygons are triangles. So some squares are triangles. Same form, bad result.
Yeah.
Now, the important thing about that is that because of the fact that you like those premises and you like the conclusion, you thought the reasoning was okay. And the only way that you're going to be able to be like, all right, hold on, wait a minute here, is that if you've got someone saying, explain to me how you got there, or someone who says, that doesn't look right to me. Because whenever we're just talking to each other, whenever we're just doing that, and we like the conclusions that we're getting to, we're highly likely to just be able to be like, okay, that's a conclusion I like. The reasoning must be good. I got it. I got premises that I like. That's how I reason. You reason from stuff you like to places where you think that it looks like it's plausible. You end up with these delusions that emerge just because of the goofy meat between our ears. We're simians that are built to be able to kind of manage things right in front of us. And whenever we have to do any offline thinking, we kind of lead ourselves astray because of the commitments that we've got. What's required is that we need to be able to explain ourselves to somebody who just goes, I just don't see it. And that's the role that Disagreement's got, because otherwise we are excellent rationalizers. And it turns out the smarter that my Vanderbilt students are, the more they dig in. Yeah. Intelligence is not, I've got to say it 100, I got to tell them 100 times, and taking a logic class doesn't even do it. Intelligence is not a way to prevent rationalization. In fact, intelligence gives us more capacity to be able to do it. And so the challenge that I think that we've got is not in terms of getting better at certain kinds of technical things and things like that. It's actually developing certain kinds of habits of taking objections.
That's fantastic. And it's interesting to me that when you talk about these, habit development practices, right, that the only way to do that is by entering into spaces where those habits are likely to get developed, which is what brings me, Kim, to some of your work on this concept of the social. What is it that you mean when you talk about the social as a space where we engage in this sort of virtuous practice that creates for us the, you might say, minimal likelihood that we rationalize into error, right? Like, how does that function, and why is it that you see that as a political phenomenon?
Well, so the thing that I think I would like to add in is the kind of knowledge that we need in order to govern well is necessarily requiring the perspectives of others, right? And so it's easy to think that, especially if we're educated, right, to go back to Scott's point, that we're simply knowing better. And in fact, in many academic institutions, that's actually what we're modeling for students, is that if only you get to the point of having this knowledge which is available to you, then you can be right all the time. And in fact, politically speaking, what we need to do is shift more to a more subjective version of knowledge, where we recognize that what's important in the public sphere is for me to bring my experiences, but for my experiences to be shaped by your experiences, by Scott's experiences, because we don't have any control over the experiences that we come into this life with, right? Think Heidegger, think thrownness. And so, as a kid, I was growing up, my dad taught special needs kids. That's a really formative part of my youth. And I can't change that. And I can't change what that does to my thought process.
Right.
But neither can anybody else. And so it's only when we allow our worldview and our perspective and our understanding of the current moment to be shaped by the experiences of others around us that actually creates at least the context where we can have a political epistemology that we might want to in some way get on board with, right? So I start off with the experiences of a father who taught special needs being a really important shaping force. And then I add in a husband who works at the VA. I have one kid who works in corporate America, another who is an athlete. And now you're beginning to get a much more interesting set of experiences that can be formative in terms of where do you want to be politically? But all of that sort of presupposes a humility that we need to do a better job of thinking through how we model that in the classroom, because I don't think we are, right? And that's, to me, going to be one of the interesting tricks as we move forward, is how do we, it's certainly one thing to talk about empathy, right? And teaching empathy and trying to allow empathy to sort of undergird our political commitments, or the way that we think about shaping knowledge. But we can't lose track of humility.
Yeah.
Because as Scott says, we are all wrong. We are necessarily all wrong. The problem is we don't know when.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's so interesting, because when I think about humility as a kind of virtue, I think on the one hand, right, about Socrates, who says that, only if we begin in humility, the term he'll use, of course, is that we are willing to engage aporia, this state of perplexity or confusion. Only then could we be open to truth seeking, right? And it's fascinating, because I teach my students that Socrates is effectively saying the same thing as Kendrick Lamar when he says, sit down, be humble. Like, it's just what opens us on to the possibility of learning what we think we already know, right? But that requires that we are aware of the possibility that we don't. And this, Scott, goes to your point about, we are really good at rationalizing away the possibility of our own error, right? We are excellent at creating a world that makes the beliefs we hold the best explanations for our experiences. And I mean, we have historical examples of this, right? Even in astronomy, the idea that we would create elaborate Baroque systems of epicycles to explain what our experience of these movements of heavenly bodies are. But all it took was just changing one of our assumptions, and everything worked. But the idea of resisting the change in the assumption, at least for me, is what I run into with my students all the time, right? And again, at Furman, very smart, very well prepared. They have, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, really varied experiences, and they've spent time overseas, and they've got all kinds of different, opportunities that they've been allowed to have. And then they walk into the classroom, and I'll say, okay, but what if the stuff you take for granted were otherwise? And for them, they're like, well, but then that throws up in the air a lot of stuff I need to stay grounded. So I'm not going to go down that road with you. Just tell me what I need to know for the test, because I need the A to maintain the world that I am happy living inside of, right? Where my success is guaranteed because of the privilege of being at a school like this. And so I think part of what can be very troubling, and you're both hitting on this, is the idea that when we think with others, we've got a cognitive side, Scott, which again, you're talked about this as the reasons we take ourselves to have for the beliefs we find ourselves holding. And then Kim, you're saying, but accompanying those beliefs are also a whole set of experiences that we tend then to universalize, rather than taking seriously the contextual contingency by which the beliefs we find ourselves having have been anchored in lots of the experiences that may not be shared beyond our very small community, right? So what are, Scott, some of the strategies that you have found successful in encouraging people to think a little bit differently there?
Yeah, so I'm given my temperament, I'm better at finding pathologies than paths out. Here's one. I mean, again, I'm so instead of putting it in that negative sense, maybe the better one is to kind of think of it as troubleshooting, and finding kind of areas where we can sort of slip up. And notice, by the way, that we've taken an approach here that requires a sort of a default respect, a kind of a default open inquiry norms, a lot of inclusion strategies of saying something like, look, we're going to talk it out, right? And one of the worries is that that strategy, that broadly Millian, John Stuart Mill had a defense of free inquiry and these free inquiry norms. The truth will out. We're going to submit things to public scrutiny, and we're going to talk it out, and we're going to aggregate our evidence, and when cooler heads will prevail whenever we put all this together. And the trouble that I think that emerges, and a good deal, I think, of the skepticism that folks have of the public sphere, is the fact that those norms are way open to free riders. People who will show up and be dogmatic, people who show up and be abusive, people who show up and will repeat the same reasons over and over again, and people who will take advantage of certain kinds of presumptions that people have got, and that instead of airing them out and rebutting them and giving more evidence against them, it turns out that what it does is it gives more oxygen to views that it turns out maybe are not as reason responsive as we had hoped. And that so on the one hand, Kim has said, like, look, there's a kind of a humility and maybe a kind of an empathy that may need to be kind of background effective attitudes that we show up with. But notice, by the way, that people with empathy, so I show up and it's like, hey, I've got intellectual charity. Kim shows up and it's like, okay, I've got this intellectual empathy. And the problem is that people who are charitable and empathetic make themselves doormats to people who are neither charitable and who are free riders and who are sadists and intellectual sadists. And so I've kind of got, like, the next stage of this is that we've got a lot of stories as to, okay, we've kind of got a kind of an ideal account as to how all of this works. It looks like we've fallen away from it. And on the one hand, I think that we've fallen away from it because of the fact that we've just got intellectual free riders. And that shows up in classrooms all the time. I mean, anyone who's had a disruptive student who thinks that it's all about them. Sometimes you feed the beast, and like feeding the beast just makes it worse, right? Okay, so we recognize the fact that like a classroom can be a kind of like a mini little version of this. But the last part of it is that once we've seen that we've got these norms that would be great defaults, it looks like they are pervertible and free rideable. Yeah. Is the question I've got now is reasserting those norms and reinforcing those norms actually a good path back? Because I think that there are some kinds of pathologies and some kinds of illnesses that we can get where the prevention, the enforcing the norms that would have prevented it, no longer are actually paths back. So like a very simple example is a health example. Like we've kind of got, like we think about this like as a cognitive health thing. It's like, okay, like, look, you know, if
I think Scott just paused. We'll give him a second to pop back in. There he is. Sorry, Scott, you paused just for a second.
Okay, sorry,
cognitive health. And hilariously, cognitive health, then you froze. I saw a shirt the other day that said, I'm all into fitness donut in my mouth. So there you go. Sorry, cognitive health.
So, okay, one quick analogy is just this cognitive health phenomenon, which is, or analogy, which is, you know, if you think that you've got high blood pressure, you can be like, look, you know, there's one sense in which like the prevention is also the cure. Don't eat as much salt. But then there are other cases where the prevention actually makes things worse. So again, one example could be like, look, heavy exercise would be a way to prevent heart disease. But once you've got heart disease, heavy exercise is actually a way of exacerbating it. Yeah. And so the question that I've got, and the question that's kind of animating me right now is, are we in the kind of the high sodium kind of case where a little bit more prevention is maybe the path back? Or are we in another situation where we actually need to take a different kind of path? Are we in a kind of a heart disease kind of path where the prevention actually may exacerbate the situation? And look, if the thought here is that like politeness norms are like a good way to, or maybe a good kind of conversational analogy, I'm inclined to think that politeness norms are an escalating phenomenon. It's like, how often have you said, like, things have gone off the rails and then you say, I'm asking politely. You're like, whoa, hey,
yeah,
that actually seems worse now. So I've kind of got this worry that once the intellectual social intellectual pathologies are in place, I worry that the preventative strategies that we had from before are actually going to be exacerbating strategies instead of curative strategies.
Interesting. So one of the things that a question just came in that speaks directly to this, and you mentioned this, and so I want to make sure that we take the opportunity of responding. Again, anybody who's watching, drop your questions in. We'd love to engage. But they say, look, one of the assumptions, other than just humility and that we've got to have certain types of virtues like hospitality or empathy, another important thing is this assumption of reason giving or rational discourse as guiding our discursive practices, that's a commitment to. And that means, as you say, not all perspectives, not all views, not all claims can be considered equally, because some of the views that are then presented have manifestly problematic assumptions, or they may be operative in such a ways that they're actually making discourse less likely, right? If I enter and say, everyone who has salt and pepper beards clearly is irrational. Well, I'm now excluding certain members of the discourse in ways that are shutting down the conversation before we can even consider the reasons given for the views being held, right? So, Scott, before we then pull back out, and Kim, I want to get your thoughts on how this links then to identity. We've got a question coming in about that. But what does it look like, Scott, for reason to be a shared commitment? Because one of my worries, and this maybe is again a salt or exercise question on my side, is, and for our viewers, Scott and I have had a long-standing debate about sort of the nuances of this question. At what point can we assume something like reason as a public property, right? Maybe what counts as reason giving, what counts as the right kinds of deliberative practice, is itself already owing to a particular version or set of experiential conceptions about what social good looks like. And for what it's worth, Scott, you have convinced me, nope. Reason is public and all the way down, baby. If we're going to do democracy, we've got to have a commitment to public reason. But lots of philosophers think there is no such thing. So what do you see as reason as a public idea? Is that even plausible?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the objective of public reason is one that is clearly a pretty optimistic default that we've got. Democracies are sort of forged in disagreement. I mean, we really kind of don't need politics unless we have some disagreement. The question here is, how do we resolve it, and what's our path forward, and what are our procedural paths? So again, that's a kind of a realist attitude of democracy, but that's maybe a good place to start. Maybe one of the places to start with public reason is to really look at ways that we start with just the disagreements. Because one of the places that I think that a background feature of disagreements is that whenever we disagree and we say we really need to get to the bottom of this, if we are starting to argue about it, we agree about something, namely the necessity of needing to solve this. If we're going to be arguing something out, it looks like there's a kind of shared enough background for us to say, this isn't working. We need to fix something. There needs to be some path forward. And so we're recognizing, because there are plenty of disagreements that we've got where we just walk away. We're like, no sweat, right. I don't care, right? And maybe those are cases where the reasons don't match up or anything like that. But there are kind of cases where it looks like that if we've got enough of the shared goods and shared values to think that we need to hash it out, looks like it's a kind of a case that we've got enough shared reasons to be able to do it. Now,
gotcha.
You might call it the multiculturalification of democracies, the sort of the further multiplicities. And again, that I think is just a function of the freedom functions of democracies. If you think that a default feature of a democracy is the protection of individual rights, or at least certain kinds of Republican virtues of democracies, I think that the depth of the disagreements that emerge from democracies is in some ways good news about the fact that the democracy is actually functioning well. It's bad news about like us being able to get to the bottom of the disagreements and things like that.
Right.
But I think so. It's kind of like a good bad news phenomenon. The good news is that if you've got a lot of deep disagreements in a democracy, that means you got freedom. Like folks are talking and folks are getting to talk to each other and get wilder and wilder views, and no one's stopping in and stomping them out and anything like that. That's amazingly good news. That's a kind of a great freedom norm. That's a good sort of test for whether or not you got the freedom norm. If everyone's like thinking lockstep, that's weird meta evidence of the fact that maybe non-intellectual factors are in play here. So that's kind of the approach that I've got, which is that like the deeper the disagreements and the more widespread it is, I think that that's actually a good indication of the health of a democracy. But again, that's a little bit more of the controversial kind of view, but that's the good news, bad news of deep disagreement.
Yeah, and before we get Kim to tell us how this plays out sociologically and then the political science side, let me highly recommend Scott and Rob Talise's book, Why We Argue and How We Should. The reason I mention this book in particular is because what, Scott, you just described, of course, is in that book, you differentiate between deep disagreement and absolutely deep disagreement. And of course, that distinction is one that on most folks is maybe one step too nuanced to matter. I think it's actually really important. Because as you're saying, deep disagreements, these things that really do impact who we are, how we understand the world, and then how we go about navigating shared engagements within the world. If we don't have deep disagreements, then it seems like the stakes of conversation are really, really low, right? Everything becomes trivial. But if we have absolutely deep disagreements, then we don't have enough in common even to get the conversation off the ground. It's as if we're playing two different sports and getting frustrated because you keep trying to kick the basketball through the goal. And it's like, I don't know what we're doing, right? So let me highly recommend Why We Argue and How We Should. It is a great book to think about some of that parsing. But this brings us then, and bring Kim back in here, to this question that came in from Ken Hayes. How much of political discourse comes out of discourse tied more closely to identity rather than policy? Are right and left, for example, more sociological or coalition or identity distinctives than they are different visions of things like public policy? And Kim, obviously, as the politics professor, you're the right person to think that through. And this is a thing I think that, in particular, your work on Hannah Arendt has a lot of helpful resources for being able to unpack. So how would you respond to Ken's question here?
So can I go back first to make one comment about Scott?
Absolutely.
So what I love about his comments is that I think he's given us a way to go back and address his point about whether or not we're too far gone. Does the preventative stuff still work? Because if we're at the point where we actually don't share commitments, if we're at the point where we can't even identify, like, what are the historical shared commitments that we can all agree to, then maybe that's one way of judging. Because I kept sitting here thinking, well, when's he going to tell me if we're too far gone or if we're not? I need to know the answer because I have classes to prepare. And so, but maybe that is the way, right? Do we anymore have a set of shared commitments that we can point to and say, yes, this is at least where we should start our reasoning from, and then we can worry about whether reason works, but this is like the ground that it starts from. So I'm gonna play this weird political science role for a minute. When I was growing up, it was harder to tell the difference, and for those who are outside of the US, apologies, this is mostly going to be about American politics. The differences between the two parties were not at all what they are now. And so Alan Abramowitz has this great term, party sorting, by which he means, when I was a kid, we could talk about liberal Republicans, we could talk about conservative Democrats. Those two terms had meaning. When I say that in a classroom to students these days, they just look at me like, so I don't understand. What would a liberal Republican look like? And fair enough, right? Because they're those distinctions have mostly become insignificant. And in a way, it was purposeful, because at least in the 1950s, the American Political Science Association came out with this suggestion that, like, these parties are too confusing. People don't know what they're voting for. What we need is more ideologically kind of cohesive political parties, and then we could have a really highly functioning democracy. And so, of course, here we are, and they got exactly what they asked for.
Careful what you wish for. Yes.
Yeah, well, too much salt, clearly.
And so functional, what do we in fact mean by a functional democracy is a real question. But I also think part of what has happened is that, yes, we have gone like wholesale into identity, in part because like fiscal conservatism is just not that sexy. And if your selling point, and here's where both Republicans and conservative Democrats had some common ground, like maybe they didn't necessarily agree what fiscal conservatism exactly meant, but they did agree that that was a shared commitment, that we needed to pay a lot of attention to being careful with the people's money. And that was one of our primary aims. But it's probably not the kind of thing that actually gets people to the polls, right? And so if Scott's sitting around on election day wondering about whether or not he should go vote, he's got 2 kids to get to soccer practice, he's got 3 classes to prep for tomorrow, he hasn't even made dinner yet, and fiscal conservatism is probably not rocking his world enough that he's like guaranteed to show up like in full body armor, right? And yet, I think the challenge is that what they've done a pretty good job of rhetorically is linking identity with policy, even sometimes when that doesn't actually work out all that well. And when it doesn't work out all that well, then it's gotten muddled. But all the attention is going to those issues where identity and policy outcomes line up with one another, because that motivates voters to get to the polls. And so too much of getting exactly what we asked for, right? Because I can remember complaining to students like, why aren't the Democrats more cohesive? Why don't they go ahead and force out these Southern Democrats who aren't towing the party line? And we did it. I mean, it happened, right? And so now you have just a different kind of problem. And the question is, how do you, I don't know. I mean, I think part of it is, how do you rebuild an agenda where people actually are able to kind of talk across difference? And at least part of my answer, because I'm at least as skeptical about reason as Scott, and I also recently read Monica Guzman's I never thought of it that way, is that maybe, and it links up with Hannah Arendt nicely, maybe experience is a better way to ground not only our ideological commitments, but also our discourse, because at least then you can't just grab onto an abstract concept and hold it so tight that you can't question it, right? And it gives you a way to even say to, let's say in my case, the son that I love dearly and disagree with, tell me a little bit more about the experiences that you've had that have led you to hold this particular view so dearly. Because I really do think both parties have shifted away from fiscal conservatism. And that's what we mean when we say the middle has dropped out. That was the thing that could connect us. But both parties have shifted away from it. And so there are a lot of people for whom that was, and still is, the number one issue, right? Let's talk to me about my taxes and what you're gonna do with my taxes. If that's your number one commitment, you're having a really hard time to find a place to land for at least 8 years, if not longer.
So what do you then say? I got a question that just came in that said, but what about things like grudge voting, or I want to stop the other person, where then it's not so much what connects us, unless maybe what connects us is a kind of disdain, right? Or a kind of dismissiveness toward a particular option. What do we say then for that? Because it seems like that might be a new, weird, maybe unhealthy, I don't know, version of coalition.
Negative voting has always been a part of our politics. That's not something new. It's disdain, although that the disdain has increased. The disdain has in fact increased. But I don't think it's just disdain. I think it's also a vision for what we would like to see moving forward. And so disdain becomes your vision for what you would like to see moving forward scares the bejesus out of me. That's what I think you mean by disdain. And I do think there's an underlying difference in what our sort of ideal version of shared commitments becomes 4 years down the road, 10 years down the road, whatever it is. I don't know if that answered the question at all.
No. So Scott, one of the things that I have argued in some of my work, which I know is kind of nonplussing to you, I don't even know if that's a verb, but it leaves you nonplussed.
It is now.
It is now.
Right. My sister, who's an English professor and religion professor, said to me once that the difference between what she does and philosophers is that we get to make up words and our peers say yes instead of the peers saying no. That's not a word. Right? So here's my thought as an existential philosopher approaching political philosophy, which is a lot of what I've done in my career. If we lean into something shared, like the human condition as defined by vulnerability and relationships. Like this is a thing that is true for all of us. It's the condition for the experiences that we do not hold in common. The reason they're not in common is because we have different relationships and we have navigated our vulnerability in different spaces. Part of why what's called standpoint epistemology, of course, has been so influential over the last 20, 30 years is because it's taken seriously. Well, what about those whose vulnerability is more presciently social? What if we listen to those voices, the views from the margins, in ways that then inform things like policy? But ultimately, my reading of all of this is if we take seriously something like the human condition as an existential equalizer, this does not get us over disagreement in problematic ways, but it anchors us in the sense that all of us share something really, really profound. Namely, we are aging, we are going to die eventually, and we are all scared of stuff that connects to that. And it turns out, I think that that's actually a lot when it comes to what I share with another person. Maybe that's not enough for, agreeing about immigration policy or finding a way forward, but it might be enough for not immediately seeing my interlocutor as irrational or immoral, because I can see in them the very kinds of intuitions that define my own experience at its most basic level. So why is it that maybe that existential view isn't enough? Or maybe what is that missing? Because it's something that I don't see a lot in political theory, which is much more focused on, our vision of the good, or do we have conceptions of, what social life is about, or what even does it mean to be a person in a Rawlsian sense? I'm more interested in, look, run into a really big wall, you're gonna fall over and knock yourself out. It's like the Breakfast at Tiffany's song, right? We kind of like that movie. Maybe that's enough. Like maybe what we're looking for is 2 steps too far down the road of actual human interconnectedness. What do you think, Scott? I don't know. Am I just, peeing in the wind on that? Am I missing the boat? What do you think?
Well, look, I don't have a strong view about the existentialist politics. Look, I think that there's something really to the thought that we must govern with the realities of human frailty the finitude of our lives,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that our I don't like using Heideggerian language, but the situations into which we're born affect us, and that our context can make it so that we need to be able to have the freedom to navigate not just the simple facts of humanity, but also the facts of the situations into which we're born. One of the challenges I, as just a flat-footed liberal, have is that I think that thrownness is, again, I'll just use the Heideggerian language. I'll just jump in. I just think that thrownness makes us sort of think too strongly in terms of, yeah, you've got a community and now you've got all these obligations internal to that community, and that burdens you in a way that I think that, again, I, as a liberal, am like, yeah, you may have obligations, but they're not ones that the state should enforce.
Right.
You don't. I mean, if you don't want to take care of your aging parents, the state shouldn't make you have to do that. If your father wants you to do stuff with your body, you're not bound by that. And so, all of the so on the one hand, I think that there are realities about human nature that maybe existentialism gets right. But on the other hand, it looks like there are approaches that say maybe we're a little bit more free than that. The other part of it is I just think that, like, look, if we're going to be governing for a lot of people who think that, no, history is an essence, there are essences to humanity, and existentialists just get humanity wrong. Like, I'm a child of God. I'm not a child of Sartre. If we govern as existentialists, these people who say that they're children of God are going to be like, this state is very alien to me.
That makes sense.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, before we go into our break to thank our sponsors, I am sure that there will now be T-shirts coming out with the camping logos that then say, child of God, not child of Sartre. So we'll make sure to throw some kickback to Dr. Aikin whenever that happens. So let's take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and dig into both some more policy specific questions. Ranked voting, is that helpful? And we'll also look at some issues that I want to draw out from the political philosopher Chantal Mouffe, who's one of the most influential on my own thinking when it comes to her conception of agonism. And I want to think through what that means, because as I'm sitting here, Scott, I'm thinking, man, I also kind of agree with you about all these liberal intuitions, but I land more in a Mouffian space, which I do think has a little bit more, shall we say, existential awareness. And maybe that's good, maybe it's not. So we'll be right back in just a second. Let me thank everybody for being here. Again, drop comments in the live stream wherever you are, and we'll bring you into the show. We'll be right back. I hope you are enjoying Campfire Philosophy. I would like to take a moment to thank Planksip for sponsoring the show. Daniel Sanderson is the guy behind that media outlet, and he is a fellow lover of philosophy. So if you get a chance, head over to planksip.org. That's PLANKSIP.org. If you sign up for their ideal plan and use the offer code AARON, that's AARON, you will get 50% off for the first 6 months. Free book publishing and lots more. Go check them out. And thanks so much to Daniel and Planksip for sponsoring Campfire Philosophy. Now, back to the show. All right. So again, thank you so much, planksip.org. Everybody go check them out, doing amazing stuff, modeling what we talked about last week in public philosophy. And they also offer an amazing resource for people interested in what we're talking about tonight, the idea of deliberative engagement, bringing ideas to a broader public, receiving critique, thinking about your conceptions in the way that they invite, you might say, everyday philosophers to find an audience. And so I highly recommend planksip.org. Thanks to Dan Sanderson for all his support and encouragement getting Campfire Philosophy with J. Aaron Simmons off the ground. Go check them out. Use the member code CAMPING or Aaron. Either one will work for 50% off. So thanks you so much to them. All right. So let's think in terms, let's get a little bit more theory, and then let's get practical. Theoretically, Chantal Mouffe is my... Oh, sorry. Kim is jumping in. Yes.
I want one question for Scott. So what if our shared political commitment is that everyone should be able to take herself up as a project? And so the political obligation or the obligation of the state is to create the possibility each individual can take herself up as a project.
Sounds liberal.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a kind of a default autonomies, default self-creation program. Notice, by the way, that even starting there still is one that I think, again, I'm just trying to put myself into a certain kind of mindset, which is that if we are producing selves that are projects of what, that's the other puzzle. It doesn't. So yeah, I think that one of the worries is that like it's a sort of a hyper individualist approach. I think that's in some ways I don't have too much of a problem with that in terms of just an approach in terms of being able to make policy and in terms of being able to limit what kinds of things we make obligatory. But the last part of it is that it's harder then to be able to explain what it is that we owe to each other. And because if we're taking ourselves as projects, again, the thought would be like, if ourselves as projects is the prime mover here, what exactly is a political norm if we've got that? And I mean, again, I'm kind of struggling to think that like, if this is a justification for the political norms, I'm not entirely sure what a political norm is there, if it's grounded on that. Now, again, maybe that's just a sort of an answer that every liberal's kind of got a version of this problem. But maybe there's something to that project. Again, I like the proposal. I'm a million in this regard, so it's like I like that proposal. I'm down with that. And so the puzzle is going to be just like, okay, well then where does political normativity come other than just protecting that?
And so just to respond to a couple of these questions that are popping up, I don't think that means just you in the state. I think it means part of the business of the state, which is to say the business of us all, is to investigate barriers to taking oneself up as a project, as part of the business of the state, right? And so this is another one of the ways that I think you could conceptualize a commitment to human rights, right? That human rights are that which allows us to take ourselves seriously and to at least have some self-authorship, if not, I don't necessarily think autonomy, but to have some self-authorship. And so it makes the investigation of the barriers to self-authorship the business of us all.
What do you think about that, Scott? I mean, one of the concerns that I have with, we might say, a Heideggerian approach, when I say existential, of course, I'm thinking more a concern for what it means to be a being like us navigating a social space as constitutive of our experience. But we can do that in specific ways. And of course, if we go into the Heideggerian space, where projects and self-making, even a Sartrean space where radical freedom and responsibility becomes, in many ways, this kind of thing that is essential, but only insofar as I decide to make it such. Part of the worry can be that it does lead to maybe a really thin, it almost like it moves toward not just a thin theory of the good, but almost a radically minimalist conception of the state, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Nozick starts sounding very Heideggerian.
Yeah. So I think that there might be one extra element to it, and again, I'm just hypothesizing now in terms of where to take some normativity here, because one of the other elements has got to be something like a publicity norm of those lives. So we might say something like, look, if we think of these as sort of self-creation programs, one of the ways that self-creation can be most responsibly done and most effectively done is that if you might say something like, know some FAQs about those lives, right? Where it's like, look, it would be really great if we had more information about the styles of life that are around. So we say, okay, look,
Yeah.
we think about a liberal state as ensuring lots and lots of experiments in living, and in some ways protecting them from each other and intruding on each other, and kind of treat them in some ways as experiments. It's like, okay, well, look, the experiment next door shouldn't get in the way of the other experiments, and so on. But there needs to be a publicity requirement. They need to be sharing their results. They need to be talking about the ways that they've been successful, or the ways that they've been unsuccessful, and at least by their own rights. And in this regard, I think that there may be something a little bit more robust. So again, I'm now getting drawn, like we're talking to each other and kind of drawing something out here, that that there are going to be certain kinds of communicative and epistemic norms that emerge from it, that are about, again, a kind of a publicity story about, like, yeah, here's a life that works very well. One last element to this that, again, I worry about is that there are many lives that, for them to be them, they must be in some ways held as ones where you have singular focus. And a simple example would be something like, look, in order for me to live the life of temperance that I wish to live, the singularity of focus of my life of temperance is one that requires that I'm not constantly getting updated about how awesome the life of heavy drinking is. And so on the one hand, I do have this kind of like, if we think about it as experiments, if we think about it as these experiments in living, we've got a publicity norm, but the publicity norms, it looks like, also conflict with other kinds of singularity of focus that some of these lives have got. And the question is whether or not we think that those publicity norms override other norms.
So this norm question is what I think, for me, always throws me back into a Mouffian perspective, right? Where Chantal Mouffe, in a book that has really deeply impacted the way I think about democratic deliberation and democratic politics, called The Democratic Paradox, she argues that antagonism is deeply detrimental for a functioning democracy, where we hate each other, we act in opposition just because we're oppositional. It's the whole, it's something that I might do if somebody is a Florida Gators fan. I will act contrary to their interests just because I am a Florida State Seminoles fan. Like, this kind of antagonistic stuff. Or, my goodness, as a Toyota truck driver, like Jeeps, gross. Like, so if we operate at that level, the idea of a shared engagement around something like public goods, even if disagreement continues, becomes an unlikely project. And so the normativity becomes, how can I anchor myself and reinforce the isolated boundaries of my group, build ourselves up in ways that allow us to destroy the opposition, so that then our vision of the good becomes now socially normative without opposition, right? Like, antagonism leads to a very, very authoritarian norm within a supposed democratic space. But she says, if we, instead of antagonism, think of agonism here is the sense of deep disagreement continues, but that deep disagreement continues in the context of norms like, I take really seriously that your life is one where you should be able to pursue flourishing. And I take seriously that your experiences might be different than my own. And so I've got something to learn, even if it turns out that at the end of the day, I still think you're wrong. Right? That these commitments to each other's well-being is not a theory of the good in any metaphysical sense, but simply an agreement to what it looks like to share a community together. And this is what then allows for really important disagreement to be actually the point of democracy. So for Mouffe, anything like a middle way politics, or, the kind of Tony Blair or Bill Clinton, hey, let's meet in the middle and we'll all find consensus around some key stuff. She's like, this is a really bad political strategy, because what it ultimately does is says the hard stuff, we'll just not focus on that. And her point, no, the hard stuff is where real learning happens. It's where real transformation can occur. And it's also where we learn how to hear, listen, take seriously, and still maybe think they are wrong. And my example of what it looks like to be agonistically engaged is something that happens a lot with my students, where they'll, say some claim, right? They believe that, some Q, they believe that Q or X or whatever. And I say, well, but X seems to misunderstand this other point. It forgets that, Y. And often they will respond, Dr. Simmons, I just don't think you're hearing me. And my response is, no, I'm hearing you. I think you're wrong. Like, it's possible to really understand your view, really take seriously the reasons you have for it, not think it is unreasonable to hold that view, but think that it's the wrong view to hold. And that kind of agonistic engagement is one that I think is robustly missing in a space where we think, if I disagree with that person, it's because they represent not just a different vision for public life, but they represent a vision that is rabidly unjust, radically immoral, and maybe even inhumane, right? So how is it, to either of you, how is it we can maybe maintain the norms of deliberation, whether or not we agree with public reason as a, stable idea? We can maintain these norms while saying, look, some disagreements don't get to raise to the level of public discourse in productive ways. So, for example, Scott, your instance of the person just touting the virtue of drunken stupor. Well, it seems to me that there are probably really good social reasons for thinking that's not a view that we're going to allow to get much social traction. But to make it even more, obvious, I would think, racist views or sexist views or, radically, anti this or that religious group views or xenophobic views. Like, these aren't just disagreements. These are immoral, but we don't have to play it out at an immoral level. It's not a matter of disagreeing about the good. We are not letting these views gain traction because they minimize the likelihood of deliberative norms continuing to function, right? If we shut down the discursive table, then it looks like we now have no norms at all, right? We've just blown it up, and we're again moving right back toward antagonism, which moves us toward authoritarianism, which ends the very productive conversation the three of us are having. So how is it that we can differentiate between, like, not allowed in some sort of moral sense, but allowed just in the sense of this is a conversation worth having among people of goodwill, despite really robust disagreements? Either one of you, what do you think?
One possibility for the difference between antagonism and agonism is that in the case of antagonism, or in the worst case scenario, you are so invested in thwarting the Gator fans that you actually will harm yourself in the process, right? You will actually disadvantage your own ideals in order to thwart the Gator. So you're willing to inflict self-harm in order to harm your opponent. And so I think, that's one way of conceptualizing how you slip from one to the other. And I think if you're gonna remain in something like agonism, you're gonna have to be able to continue to cultivate curiosity so that you can absolutely cheer against the Gators at every opportunity, but at least in the process, you have to wonder and be willing to ask why it is that someone would root for them. And if you can continue to cultivate your own curiosity, then maybe you have the possibility of remaining in that we haven't crossed over to the antagonism terrain, because you're continuing the conversation, right? And It's when we cease the conversation and are so committed to defeating our opponent that we're willing to inflict self-harm in the process that then we've gone too far, as maybe Scott would have said earlier.
And Scott, for you, it reminds me of a kind of Rortian approach, which I know you would not like, but understood as a sort of infinitivist sort of justification, right? That, look, the conversation continues so long as there are questions that are relevant enough to keep having it. Justification is still required. But when do we say, well, yeah, there are people running around, asking for justification for moral equality of all humans or something. And you're like, yeah, it's not that we need to go down this road because those are still being asked. It's that still asking those reflects a kind of antisocial norm that we must oppose. How is it that we can start, parsing some of that, even if we are committed to a robust, continuing conversation as a social act of justification?
Well, so I'm not inclined to do any line drawing here, but one of the challenges is that some of these norms are written into constitutions. I mean, so it's like, look, we're running a state where we're bound by a constitution. If some of these reasons are ones where it's like, yeah, we need to redo a constitution. If you want to have that conversation, start winning elections. Until then, let's be bound by the rules that we said that we're bound by. So that's one of the benefits of constitutions. Founders were wise in a lot of ways. That's a good place to start. I think that the next one is one that I think is in one of the challenges that I think that I have as both a theorist and a participant of arguments in democracy and things like that, is that I regularly have this double vision where I will see some pathology or I will see some debate. And so Nashville just had neo-Nazis marching all over. They came to my children's and my wife's synagogue and they were there. And I was like, and I, as a theorist, it was like, this is an amazing moment. And then as a person and a inhabitant in a household with and raising Jewish kids and so on, I was like, this is a nightmare. And so I think that part of this is recognizing the ways that certain investments in the projects, I think Kim rightly said, self-construction, and that these projects have got to maintain a kind of inner autonomy, but also recognizing how fragile they are and ways that we've got to have protections for those. And again, ways in which some kinds of projects are noxious in ways that make it so that others can't have those lives. And so again, it's a kind of a meta rule where it's like, look, if the Nazis were just doing Nazi stuff and not doing stuff outside their basements, in some ways that that would be, I guess, okay in a way. I'd feel sorry for them. They live a life of hate. So maybe on an analogy with the incels, where it's like they've got a community where they kind of pat each other on the back for not getting any sex and they blame the women and that's about it. The problem is that all of these communities have got other features of the fact that they then act out and then they do things. And that the way that they affect their cognitive economies affects their affective economies, and then affects their behavior. And I think that the answer has regularly got to be that we are in contact with people and not just treating them as though they're mentally defective. That's not a way. That is not a way to convince anybody. That is not a way. And shutting them out doesn't stop them. If they're standing in front of your synagogue, you're not going to have an argument. But if they are in a comment section, or if you are having if there are spaces where the conversation is possible, there are arguments to be had. And the more that you treat folks that are ethically beyond the pale as though they were irrational and unarguable, is going to give them nothing but evidence about the kind of evidence that you have. Now, again,
Right.
It's misleading evidence, but the more that you show them the stick, the less that they think that you've actually got reasons.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and it is a consistent phenomenon that not following free speech rules and not saying something like, look, you've got a right to protest. You've got a right to be able to get your view out. You've got a right, but we've got a right to say stuff back to you.
Yeah.
If you don't live up to those rules, they take that as evidence about the quality of your evidence, which is that it's bad.
Yeah.
And so not living up to free speech norms turns out to actually make them think that they've got a better case than they do.
Yeah.
And yes, it does give them a place. And yes, it does make it so that they get to say hateful stuff. And yes, it makes it so that it's really disruptive. But we're not under ideal conditions. We're really looking at cases where we're looking for, we need to depolarize these folks. We need to de-radicalize them. And the only way that actually happens is making it so that they have paths to being able to have conversations with normal people instead of just with each other.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that I have often thought, and I tell my students this a lot, and I'm never sure if I'm right, but I wouldn't tell them if I didn't think there was a good reason to think that I'm right, which is, look, folks, if you are at a Black Lives Matter protest standing against people who are neo-Nazis, argument is not possible in that space.
Yeah.
And there's a really good reason, like there's an actually pro-democracy reason for not arguing in that space. Because what's needed is a kind of alternative social pressure, what Mill would call a kind of external sanction that says, hey, excuse me, if you're going to hold that view and you're going to hold it publicly, racism in this case, well, there's going to be a lot of social cost to pay, and we're here to make you aware of that social cost, right? But if we then likely run into that same person who we think holds repugnant views, whether morally, politically, or otherwise, we're likely to run into them the next day at the Starbucks or the Walmart, or maybe even in our classes, right? In those spaces, now how then do you engage that person? Well, one option is to say, no, I've already decided you are no longer a participant in this discourse. But as you're saying, it's not just that it makes them think they have evidential support for the weakness of your evidence. It's also, I think, that they now can, even if wrong, they can reasonably conclude that you are the one who is modeling the vice of which you're accusing them.
That's exactly.
Right? Like, so they now have this weird, distorted moral self-righteousness, even in the context of an epistemic and moral failure. So finding opportunities to say, maybe the way, like the norm I want to lean into is, let's just get better at philosophy. Like actually doing philosophy well is a really good thing, and it's super helpful, right?
Philosophy saves democracy.
That's right.
That's a very anti-Platonic thought, but that's okay.
Well, for what it's worth, Scott, I about 3 weeks ago, right after the presidential debate, wrote a op-ed that didn't get picked up in any of the papers, so I published it on my Substack, and it was a open letter to Biden. And what was so interesting to me about doing this is I wrote it by appealing to Plato's critique of democracy slide to tyranny. And the idea was the way democracy slides to tyranny is because we begin to set aside things like deliberative give and take, and we instead reinforce our own vision as the only option that is reasonable within a democratic space. This then gives rise to a strong man who stands for that view, rather than all of us being equal participants in complicated social discourse, right? And so the whole idea was, Biden, you need what Aristotle calls friends of virtue to tell you to step aside, man. Like, in the name of your own commitment to democracy, we need you to bow out of this one. And of course, no one picked it up. But I still think what it looks like to be really committed to the good of democracy, whether, as a social vision. For some, it's, I think, a moral vision. For others, it's an epistemic vision, which is the way I read you and Rob's work, that democracy is a kind of epistemic ideal of self-regulating individuals who are able to give and take reasons from each other. And that view means that we've got to then cultivate not just norms, but actual habits by which the selves we bring to the public square have already been marked by things like, the cultivation of deliberative virtue, but also, practices of having to navigate views with which they disagree. And so one of the things, this is where I, in my liberalism, might sound to some as, something else. Part of why I think college campuses need to be spaces where we say, look, you don't have a right not to be offended. You have a right to respond and say, that's a view I find offensive, and here's why it's one that I think we should have social opposition to. Like, we do better philosophy, right? And that encouragement is something that I think needs to then get run downward. This is my shift into policy, right? Let's start allowing something like philosophical training as a democratic mode of existence be something that we're doing in elementary schools, right? This can be something that we are running downward, not just in critical thinking ways, though that would be a step in the right direction, but the idea of saying, hey, all the way down, second, third, fourth grade, there's a lot of stuff we just need you to hold as true. 2 + 2 = 4 in the vast majority of cases we know of. Typically in mid-sized objects, the law of physics work this way, right? There's all kinds of things that we just say, hey, learn this. It's what lets our bridges not fall down. But we also can do stuff in those spaces where we say, what are assumptions you have about the world? What would it look like if you held different ones? And guess what? There are people around the world who hold different ones. And that kind of practice, which somebody pointed out that said, in our multiculturalism, right? The fact that we are what Mouffe would call a radically plural democracy, or Rawls would call the fact of reasonable pluralism, there's lots of different views. And yet what I think we do is we teach people, because we don't want the conflict, we train 3rd and 4th and 5th graders to think, just toe this line, hang with this group, you don't have to worry about conflict. And then that creates this sense of what some scholars will talk about as a sort of fragility move, which can be patronizing, but I also think can be profound, where we take ourselves up as so fragile that we think the only way to care about my cognitive hygiene is not being around the people who hold those views that give me plaque on my good thinking. And yet, what you're saying and what Kim you're presenting and what Mouffe articulates and what Rorty suggests and what we find even, I think, in Plato, radically diverse political and philosophical thinkers they all will suggest we're better when we actually take seriously the stuff we think is wrong. Doesn't mean that we take it on and walk around in it, but it might mean that we are still willing to say, look, a cup of tea does not mean that I am acquiescing to your position. It just means that I am treating you as the kind of person who I think is worthy of the sort of space that we call democracy. It's like what I once heard, Scott, you may remember this actually, Linda Zagzebski, big name epistemologist and philosopher of religion, was giving a talk at Vanderbilt. And she's a theist, and so had been giving a kind of new argument, not for the truth of theism, but for sort of how to make sense of theism as a rational option. And one of the Vanderbilt professors basically raised his hand and said, look, I just don't think you're even open to the possibility that atheism is true. And of course, there we seem to have this kind of radically deep disagreement, right? And they're just standing in opposite sides. Her response was freaking brilliant. She said, oh, I'm entirely open to being shown that I'm wrong about this. I just don't think you've got the time, right? Which is such a good move, because it's saying the only way that would be possible is if we have a lot of coffee together, because this is something that is a deep commitment of mine. It's not just a peripheral belief. And so if we're going to be asking each other to rethink those deep views, we've got to recognize that they are not likely to be just abandoned because I gave you a syllogism. And that's also something important about understanding how democracy ties in to identity. There's all kinds of views that we hold that we just think, like that's one that you're probably not going to convince me of, but we should keep talking. You and I've talked about theism and atheism for 20 some years. Neither of us have convinced each other that the other is right. And yet I teach your books on atheism in my classes all the time because I think it's the best account of a view that I actually find mistaken, but not because it's irrational. And for what it's worth, it's the book I recommend to my students who come to me and say, I'm an atheist. I'm like, you know what? You need to read views that allow you to understand the cognitive respectability of the view you hold. You don't just need to hear my voice, because you need to have mentors in thinking who also can live into the truth of what it is that they're claiming that you take seriously, right? That ways of life really do matter. So all that to say, thank you, Scott, for where we disagree. I can appeal to you. Kim, you and I disagree about even some of how we read Heidegger and Arendt and what this looks like, but I can send students to your work and say, look, don't take my word for it. It's like reading Rainbow at a higher level, right? Don't take my word for it. Try this on, see what you think. There are really good reasons to think even what I'm suggesting is but one of the options available. And that's something I just think that we don't do very much of,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, well, let's get practical then. So I'm going to throw out some ideas. Some of them have been coming in comments, and you all tell me what you think about these as practices for moving us in the right direction toward productive disagreement, not antagonistic division. What about ranked voting as a mode of recognizing binary decisions are rarely actually the decisions we have to decide between? We're almost always deciding among. So would something like ranked voting, Kim, function, you think, as a way of promoting deliberative engagement rather than I'm on this or that side?
I like ranked voting. I think one of the things that we have to consider is that ranked voting is but one step, maybe in the right direction, where we can get some more moderates to be serious players in this system. We still have the problem of basically being a two-party system, which is in part dictated by these single-member districts that exist at almost every level. So I don't know that in and of itself it's enough, but I do think we should take seriously anything that moves us in the direction of getting more moderate voices in our representative institutions, because that's how you start to build that common ground back.
Yeah, which is, of course, not to say that what we need is a moderate vision of politics. It's just that we need moderate voices so that the options don't look like such a divide among extremes. We can actually say, no, there are a range here, and that keeps us from falling into the space where only my way or irrationalism, which I think is an important thing. Because I think a lot of people, when they talk about moderates, it's like, oh, let's just be wishy-washy, or what we want is just that kind of, wimpy middle. You're like, no, we want the extremes to be real options rather than just a dichotomy.
And there's nothing wimpy about the middle. I mean, the middle is a really difficult position to hold because you have to negotiate with people on either side of you. That's really hard work. And you have to be able to articulate the differences between where you are in the right and where you are from the left. And I don't know if you love this question as much as I do, but should the Democrats have an open convention is, of course, something that I've been thinking about for a couple of weeks now. I love this idea because I really love the notion that we need to see democracy in play in real time instead of just being sort of handed two different options that I would love that.
For what it's worth, fully support the Open Convention. I've argued for this publicly. It has not met with, shall we say, widespread support from the communities of discourse in which I engage on social media. But I love the idea, because everything people saw as like, this will weaken the candidate, or having the opposition will draw them down. For me, it's like, no, if we think it weakens them to have to make better arguments for the views they hold, then we've already let democracy die. And then all this, narrative of the end of democracy from the other guy, it turns out we're just killing it more slowly, right? Like there has to be a vision of, we are made better when we are having to navigate real opposition in reason-governed ways, right?
Yeah,
Scott,
I also think it strengthens.
Yes. What do you think about this then, Scott? So I mentioned doing philosophy at lower levels. You and I, all of us have raised kids. Do you think that philosophy is something that can be deployed in ways that become sort of more of a public social practice, a kind of Deweyan approach to education? Is that maybe a way forward towards the sorts of virtues that you see? Or do you think, nope, there's really good reasons we teach them geometry and we do philosophy when they're 20? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think that philosophy is good for you, but I share Aristotle's worries about philosophy. I think that philosophy can make you weird if you're not ready for it. I think that all of the worries that, I was a director of undergraduate studies for 10 years here at Vanderbilt. I got lots of calls from parents saying, little Jimmy's coming home as a vegetarian, and like, is this going to make him weird? It's like, vegetarian, like coming home as a vegetarian makes you, that counts as weird. But one of the other things that I think that is a contributing factor for our political malaise is maybe my best shot at sort of, it's not just that we're fractured. It's the fact that, like, we're tired of being fractured. Like, the one thing that we do agree on is that we hate the way that we are together. And it doesn't look like a national divorce is a thing that's doable. And the problem with divorces is the fact that, like, there are people who get left on one side in the divorces. So I think that philosophy is a place where we can think hard and we can develop all sorts of skills that maybe aren't even intrinsically political, but are ways that we think about ourselves and the things that we care about and so on, that are no longer politically salient.
Yeah.
So, like, you just do, the ship of Theseus. It's like, hey, we got this old ship, and over the course of years, they replaced all the pieces. Is it the same ship? And, all these Republicans are going to be like, well, the Republican answer is like, there's no Republican answer to the ship of Theseus. There's not like a liberal Democrat answer to the ship of Theseus.
Mm-hmm.
And notice something wild about that. Where it's like, because the thing that bothers me is just like how much of my thinking I feel like has been done for me in some of these kind of places.
Yeah.
It's fun. One of the reasons why philosophy is fun. Folks will often give it the back of the hand because it's like, oh, it's the fun. It's like, no, it's fun because you are exercising muscles that are not places that someone else has already defined as to what you're supposed to be doing. You're not just jumping through hoops and then just graded on whether or not you successfully jump through the hoops. You're just kind of developing your own voice. You're not trying to fit in with somebody else. Philosophy classrooms often have like that weird thing where it's like someone shaking their head in the background and you're like, okay, well, right. So that happens. But one of the interesting things about it is that, like, no longer is your political identity, whenever we're talking about the ship of Theseus or about you just fill in so many of these other philosophical puzzles where it's like political identity isn't relevant, or you read somebody who's just so weird. I had a class where I was teaching Aristotle, and one of the students was like, asked me, and we were talking about Aristotle and moral norms and political norms, and they said, was Aristotle a Republican? It was like, that is just the wrong question. What?
Oh my God.
Like,
wow.
And so all of the ways that, like, hey, we're thinking about stuff, and it's like the longer that we can delay the ways that our skills are going to pay these political dividends to sort of win our case or like defend the people, right?
Yeah.
If the less salient our identities are, the less we are going to be having our thoughts made for us, the more likely it is that we're actually going to have a genuine interaction. And the more likely it is that we're then going to have laid groundwork enough to actually be able to then, have a decent conversation about the things that then are matter. And I think that the puzzle for us is that like is the sort of the retreat of us, the retreat of a shared like a feeling that we've got a shared fate. I mean, the old Robert Putnam bowling alone thing was like, like all these bowling leagues, where'd they go? And like that was years ago. Like that, like when we were like, the bowling leagues are gone. You remember the halcyon days when we were worried about bowling leagues?
Right.
But it seems like that's accelerated where it's like, look, I feel like I know how you vote depending on like what kind of coffee you drink. Or, I feel like I know how you vote just by looking at what kind of car you drive or, what. It's just so many ways in which those political identities become salient. And one of the things that alienates me about even myself and the way that I see it is just that like how much of my thinking, it feels like it's me. It feels like I'm doing it. But how many of these things are really just these social pressures working on us? Yeah. And I feel like philosophy is a place where we liberate ourselves from that. It's a place, again, that's the reason why it's fun. That's you're actually flapping your own wings there. Right?
Yeah.
You're kind of doing, right? And so I think that that's a place where where we're learning some skills and we can create identities and we can create connections and we can create a kind of a feeling of shared fate that doesn't make any of those other extrinsic identities relevant.
Right.
But the last part of it is that like, once you take a taste of that kind of intellectual autonomy, coming back and then, God, like the last rally I was at, I was like, look, these folks on the right side, but I hate the way that they talk whenever they're all together. Why? Right. Because groups, whenever they get together and all agree, are not good deliberators. I suddenly was like, I kind of agree with all the things that they're saying, but I don't like me when I'm with them.
That's good.
And so I just think that like that taste of freedom is the place where we find ourselves then being able to maybe find a we and certainly find a ways that we can resist the things that keep us from being a we.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And so before we transition into our questions about camping to close our time around the campfire, what both of you have just said, I think does a really nice job of addressing one of the questions that just came in, which says, look, isn't it naive to encourage, let's say, students to enter discursive spaces with charity, with humility, but in doing so, like the other person might be so antagonistically, disposed toward them that this is maybe a naive encouragement, and it might even, and I take this seriously, it might even be dangerous, right? Like there's a real reason to be hesitant telling my students, hey, y'all go out and do this thing that I am advocating as socially beneficial. And this is why, for what it's worth, to anyone who worries that we sit around telling our students to, go become activists, I actually think there's a very small number of professors who do that sort of thing. What we try to do is say, look, let's think really well in this space, as you put it, Scott, where we are kind of freed from some of these normal social obligations and expectations so that we can decide what stuff we think is worth becoming activists in relation to, right? And one of the things I have encouraged my students comes from examples I've taken from both of you, for what it's worth. Kim, you just got back from a dance competition, ballroom dancing down in New Orleans, and did very well from what I understand. Scott, you and Rob both have argued in various ways, hey, when you go home at the holidays, do not talk politics with your family. Like, go out to eat and watch good movies. And maybe what we need to avoid these political identities from overriding our existential essence or whatever is the fact that we play softball together, or we are part of a bowling league, or it turns out we can be Gojira fans and disagree about politics, right? Like when I'm at a metal show, my goodness, like now there are some metal bands I won't go see because I take them to be leaning too far in directions I want nothing to do with. You know, Golgoroth, like not going to be there, but it's entirely amazing. When I took my son, he's 14, we went to see POD and Norma Jean, and it was an intense show. We got there early. We're on the front row against the barricade. All of the pits like pushing against the back of us, right? The lead singers are like putting their foot out on the barricade and sort of like directly above us singing, you know? And in that moment, every single person was not only singing together, but converging together in a weird set of social norms. If somebody goes down, stop, pick them up, right? If somebody's taking a head dive, make sure you do not split, hold them up. Like all of these amazing, like real relational concerns played out, and our agreement was these bands rock. Hell yeah. Like that was enough to be there. And then when we walk out of the show, none of us were saying, yeah, but who'd you vote for? Well, wait a minute. What's your view about public health, right? We walked out and we're just like, woo, did you get that drumstick? Nah, but I got a guitar pick. Woo! Like it created such a sense of community around something else. And for me, there is something powerful, and it's what I would encourage folks to realize. In order to have those difficult conversations over coffee and tea, it is important that we also realize there is a lot of other stuff that we share. We still can be Florida State fans and disagree about politics. We can be Gojira fans and disagree about all kinds of other stuff. And so maybe one of the things that philosophy tempts us toward in dangerous ways is thinking deep theoretical conversations are just better modes of engagement. And it turns out, I think, in lots of ways, just being in a church softball league might be a better mode of engagement in lots of cases. And so just not thinking there is one way to go, there is not this overly intellectualized answer to everything, I think actually is itself a pro-democracy vision. So, all right, well, we're going to shut down our technical stuff with that and model that we can disagree about all kinds of trivial things, and yet when we sit around the campfire, we've got lots in common. And so I've got 5 questions I ask all of my guests. The first question, Kim, then we'll go back and forth. Beach or mountains, Kim?
Oh, mountains. Easy.
And it turns out that's the only right answer, and anybody who disagrees is irrational. So it's an appropriate antagonism. Scott, what about you? Mountains or beach?
Yeah, I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt, but it's mountains.
I love it. And I know you do a lot of backpacking. And so it turns out that Scott and a group of us that were all at Vanderbilt together have been for years trying to find freedom from the requirements of everyday life to be able to get on the trails together with our backpacks and sit around campfires. All right, number 2, Scott, we'll start with you. When you're around the campfire, are you a hot chocolate, hot tea, or coffee drinker?
It's hot tea. Hot tea. I don't need the caffeine in the evening, even if it's been a rough day. Caffeine in the evening, so it's got to be a light tea, prefer not even caffeine. I got to get my rest. Got to get my rest because we got miles to go tomorrow. So.
Miles to go, many miles before we sleep tomorrow. Very, very cool. All right, Kim, hot chocolate, hot tea, or coffee?
If it's evening, definitely a decaf tea. Before noon, coffee is awesome.
Nice.
But you did leave out red wine.
So it turns out I had a guest like 3 weeks ago.
Where's the whiskey here?
Well, I said hot coffee, hot tea, or hot chocolate. And she goes, wine. I was like, okay. So it turns out that is a legitimate 4th option. I love it. All right. Number 3. So you're around the campfire. Other than s'mores, what's your favorite thing to cook or eat around the campfire? Kim, what'd you say?
So mine is weird. I really like what we used to call a walking salad. It's peanut butter rolled in cabbage, or cabbage rolled with peanut butter on the inside. They called it a walking salad when I was a kid at summer camp.
I've never heard of that. That's fantastic.
I'm Googling that the second that we're over. That sounds amazing.
I don't know if it's a real thing, but we had it at summer camp when I was a kid.
Oh, I love it.
Hopefully Google will give me something that just sounds like cabbage and peanut butter sounds awesome.
It sounds way better than my tortilla, peanut butter, and banana, which I take on my mountain bike rides and stuff a lot. So, yeah.
Sad sack sandwich.
That's right. What about you,
Yeah,
Scott?
I'm a hot dog guy. I just love a hot dog. I burn it, like have it be crispy. If you're backpacking, you have the ketchup packs that you stole from McDonald's that you stopped at like a month before. You're like, I'm going camping. I need to take some hot dog. I need something for my hot dogs. So I'm stealing the extra ketchup packets and putting it in the bottom of my bag. And a couple of them broke, and so they're a little bit sticky. But you get one open and then get it on the hot dog, then you eat it, and it's crispy and it's amazing, and the bun is squished. Oh, yes. That's living.
Love it.
That's living.
Love it. It's so funny. A mutual friend of ours, James Bednar, he and I were backpacking together about 2 years ago. And we both had, the dehydrated, backpacking food. And so I forget what each of us were eating, but we had, heated up the water and we made our dinners and we're eating it with our long spoons and stuff. Right. And James says, "Oh, I'm about to blow your mind." And so we've been doing philosophy all day. So I'm expecting he's got some radical view about the nature of belief coming at me. No, he found 2 sriracha sauce packets. and
that's living large.
Everything was better. It was, the whole night was improved. So from now on, I will always, and I was like, dude, where'd you get packets of sriracha? And he says, you have to special order them.
Okay.
So leave it to James to have special ordered sriracha that he forgot about. In his
The man is a planner.
Saved the night. That's right. All right. Number 3 or 4 rather. So what is it? You're sitting around the campfire. I actually forget if either of you are musicians, but you're sitting around the campfire. Somebody pulls out the guitar or the bongos if you're camping with McConaughey. And what's the song you ask them to play? So what's the campfire song you want played or that you would play if you had the guitar sitting by the campfire? What do you think, Scott?
Well, so before I moved to Nashville, I said that I played guitar, but when I moved to Nashville, I discovered that I do not play guitar.
You found out the
I tell people in Nashville, like I used to
better than you. That's right.
Okay, let's play some guitar. It's like I do not play guitar. But yeah, I'll strum a guitar around a campfire. And James Taylor's "Sweet Baby James." That was my father was a James Taylor fan. He taught me how to play guitar. That was a song that we often would strum together. And when he was about 2 years ago, he died of complications with dementia. But I took his guitar to his hospital room, and he requested "Sweet Baby James." And so I don't know if I can play it all the way through without crying, but I'll tell the story beforehand, so everyone will get a little tear in their eye.
Everybody else is,
and then we have a sip of whiskey and eat a terrible hot dog.
There you go. That's a wonderful answer. Of course, my condolences about your dad. I think I knew that you back when it happened, and yet it's continues to be a thing.
It still feels fresh, but
it names our mortality, right? And I admit when I'm around campfires, my parents are still alive, and yet there is no time I'm ever in the woods that I don't have some dimension of being with my dad in the woods, right? Like that's just part of what it means to me. So yeah, I completely appreciate that. Great song. All right, Kim, what song are you playing?
Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog.
That's amazing.
He's a good friend of mine.
I can't play it, but it is a camping song for me.
I love that. I love it.
I do not live in Nashville, and I do not play a guitar.
See, we've got all these great T-shirts coming out of tonight. I do not live in Nashville, don't play guitar, but join me by the campfire. I think tonight I am leaning into some, like, even though I know he's gone through some social disrepute, I still love his music. Some like old Ryan Adams tracks, I think, would be on my playlist around the camp. Some Sweet Carolina, things like that. Maybe even like Mission Bell, I think would be a lot of fun sitting around the campfire. So I'm kind of feeling in a Ryan Adams and the Cardinals kind of mood tonight. All right, last song, my goodness. Last question. You can take one philosopher with you to camp. You can bring them on the trails with you, alive or dead. Which philosopher do you take with you camping, Kim?
So this is not hard for me. I mean, it would have to be Arendt. But if you make it alive, maybe Adriana Cavarero.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I think Arendt would be a lot of. I imagine her being a lot of fun around a campfire. Because she had that journalist side to her, and so you've got to think like she had some jokes ready to go. So I think Arendt would be a lot of fun. Despite
bring a lot of cigarettes, though.
A lot of cigarettes.
She's gonna have a lighter, so you're gonna be able to get that fire going.
That's right. Take one of the French thinkers. They're always a good backup when the fire won't start. That's hilarious. All right, Scott. What philosopher, alive or dead, you take with you camping?
Well, so I've kind of got this this may be dumb, but it's like I think I might like to take Diogenes. Just say like, gosh, let's see what we can do. Like because I do like the minimalist camping thing, and so it's like I'll just be like, do I need this in my pack? How much do I actually need to take with me? I need to walk, but like, what else do I need to take with me? And Diogenes is just be like, nothing, bro. Let's go. Let's go. You bring in a cup, use your hands, right? So I wonder about Diogenes. It does get in the way of the drinking hot tea. You can't drink. Diogenes can drink the water with his hands. You can't drink the hot tea with his hands. I go with you, Aaron. I want to go with you.
Hey,
can you come?
We've got to make this
Let's
happen.
go, man.
I'm so ready. There. I'm so ready. I think Diogenes might be my favorite answer so far.
Okay.
All of the things that I'm thinking about what would happen, like just how silly that could be, right? But for what it's worth, I think tonight, I've given different answers on different episodes. I think tonight it's the Vanderbilt crew that we have not yet gotten together. I want all of us out on the camp trails together. You got to do it. Yeah, be amazing. Well, thank you both, Scott, Kim. Thank you so much for being here. To everybody that has been joining on with us, it's actually hilarious when I am able to see the kind of views throughout the night. What started happening, and we're now I think like 4 or 5 episodes in, is the views really spike in like the last 20-30 minutes, because I actually think more people are interested in our questions than the conversation that gets us there. So for all of you who have hung around, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. Be sure to check out Kim Maslin's work, Scott Aikin's work. It's fantastic. And if you get a chance, drop over to my own website, jaronsimmons.com, and see the stuff I'm working on. And you can get a copy of my new book, Camping with Kierkegaard, which is available there. And also make sure you check out my Substack, which is simply Philosophy in the Wild. I do 2 posts a week. This morning, actually, for paid subscribers, I did a post about the theme song called Storybook Love to the Princess Bride, and talked about ways in which philosophy can help us unpack some of the Princess Bride, occasioned, I should note, by just having seen Carrie Elwes in sort of live performance a couple days ago. And it was pretty fantastic to hear him tell stories about the 16-second fart that Andre the Giant let rip the first day on set. Like that was well worth the price of admission. So to everybody, please go over Philosophy in the Wild on Substack and then jaronsimmons.com. I would love to get connected with you and hit the trails of life together. To everybody else, We will be back next Monday at 7 for our live stream of the next episode of Campfire Philosophy with Aaron Simmons. And in the meantime, all of the episodes are available both on my YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, and also on any streaming platform. The audio goes up about 3 to 4 days after the live episode. So on Spotify, you can find all of the past episodes. This one will be available Thursday or Friday. And thanks again to Dan Sanderson for all of his work getting that stuff put out there. And remember, planksip.org is an amazing resource. They sponsor this podcast. Please go check out planksip.org and make sure that if you do get involved there and you meet Daniel Sanderson, tell him thanks so much for sponsoring Campfire Philosophy with Aaron Simmons. It is truly an honor to work with him. He has been an unflinching supporter of public philosophy for a long time, and I'm honored to have gotten to know him recently. So thank you all. And so we're going to close out tonight. I hope to see all of you next week on another episode.
On the trail, for hiking with me a few miles more, for casting out your line into waters in which we both stand, for dropping in at the top and fist bumping me at the bottom, and for coming camping with me and Kierkegaard. Our time together has been so very worthy of my finitude.